What happens when a broken slave meets the first person who asks her name instead of her price? What happens when someone buys you not to own you, but to set you free? Today's story will show you why humanity's greatest weapon isn't violence or technology. It's the simple act of seeing someone as human when the rest of the galaxy sees them as property. The stench hit you first. Sweat, fear, and something else you couldn't quite name, but wished you'd never smelled. Welcome to Kepler Station's underground slave market, where hope goes to Diwan and credits flow like water. Hundreds of beings from across the galaxy stood chained in rows. Some reptilian, others barely humanoid, a few that defied description entirely. But they all shared the same look in their eyes. Emptiness. The kind that comes from being treated like cargo for too long. That's when he walked in. Draven Mackenzie, 53 years old, built like a man who'd seen too many battles and survived them all. His right arm wasn't flesh anymore, just polished metal and synthetic muscle that whirred softly when he moved. The scars on his face told stories he'd never share with strangers. He moved through the market like a predator, purposeful, cold. Every vendor tried to catch his attention, shouting prices and promises about their merchandise. But Draven's eyes were scanning for something specific. Then he found her. Row 17, chain number 43, a girl who couldn't have been more than 22, maybe 23 in Earth years. Silver hair that caught the artificial light like liquid mercury. Violet skin that marked her as Zelanian, probably from the Outer Rim colonies. But it was her eyes that stopped him cold. They were the exact shade of blue his daughter Emma had inherited from her mother. The girl, she noticed him staring, and every muscle in her body went rigid. Her breathing quickened. Those blue eyes darted left and right, looking for an escape that didn't exist. She'd learned to read customers by now. This human with the mechanical arm and the dead expression, he looked like trouble. The vendor, a fat Brellan with too many teeth, noticed Draven's interest immediately. "Ah, excellent choice, friend. This one's fresh from the Zelanian mining colonies. Strong back, quick hands. Only been on the market 3 cycles. Previous owner said she was trouble, but I think she just needs the right kind of discipline, if you catch my meaning." Draven said nothing. He stepped closer to examine her like she was a piece of equipment. The girl pressed herself against the wall behind her chains, rattling. "How much?" His voice was gravel and whiskey. "Well, she's prime breeding stock, so I'm asking 12,000 standard credits. But for a discerning customer like yourself, I could go as low as 10. I'll give you 15. The Brellan's eyes went wide. Nobody paid more than asking price. Not in a slave market. Excuse me, sir. 15,000. Standard credits. Transfer it now and I walk out with her in 5 minutes. The girl's eyes darted between them, trying to understand why someone would overpay for her. In her experience, customers who paid extra wanted extra services, usually the kind that left scars. Money changed hands. Digital credits flowed through quantum channels. And just like that, she belonged to someone new. But as Draven approached with the release key, something strange happened. Instead of grabbing her chain like every other customer, he stopped just outside her reach. "What's your name?" he asked quietly. She blinked, stared at him like he'd just spoken in an alien language. Because in 17 months of captivity, across 4 different markets, and 7 different owners, not one person had ever asked her that question. She thought he was just another monster who'd bought her to break her in new ways. She was half right. The silence stretched between them like a chasm. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. Too many beatings for speaking without permission. Too many punishments for daring to have an identity beyond the numbers branded on her wrist. Draven waited, patient as stone. He'd learned patience the hard way in foxholes and prison cells, and the long sleepless nights after Emma died. When it became clear she wouldn't answer, he simply nodded and unlocked her shackles. The metal fell away with a soft clatter that somehow sounded louder than the chaos of the market around them. "Follow me," he said, turning away. Not a command, not quite a request either, just words in the space between them. The vendor called after them, eager to upsell, Sir, I have cleaning supplies, behavioral modification tools, restraint systems, first-time owner discount." Draven kept walking. The girl stumbled after him, bare feet slapping against the cold station floors. She kept expecting him to stop to turn around to explain what he wanted from her. But he just led her through corridors that grew quieter and cleaner as they moved away from the market district. They passed a view screen showing the local news. Something about another mining accident on Proxima 7. 37 dead, all human workers. The anchor moved on to sports scores without missing a beat. Draven's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. His ship was docked in Bay 47. Nothing fancy, just a modified cargo hauler with scratched paint and honest scars. The name Second Chance was stenciled on the hull in fading letters. Inside everything was clean but worn, functional, no luxury, no wasted space. The kind of ship owned by someone who'd learned to value substance over style. "Sit," he said, pointing to a bench near the airlock. She sat immediately, hands folded in her lap, eyes down. Perfect slave posture. It made something twist in his chest. He disappeared into what she assumed was his quarters and came back with a medical kit. Set it down next to her and opened it without explanation. "The shackles cut you," he said, kneeling down to examine her ankles. "This'll sting." She flinched when he touched her but didn't pull away. Couldn't afford to. In her experience, resistance only made things worse. But his touch was gentle, professional, like a medic treating a wounded soldier, not an owner examining his property. He cleaned the cuts with practiced efficiency, applied antiseptic, wrapped them in clean bandages. "Better," he said, sitting back on his heels. "You hungry?" Another question she didn't know how to answer. When was the last time someone had asked if she was hungry? Usually they just threw scraps at her when they remembered to feed her at all. He took her silence as a yes and disappeared again, coming back with a ration pack and a bottle of water. Real water, not the recycled swill they gave slaves. "Eat slow," he advised. "Your stomach's probably not used to real food." She took the pack with trembling hands, opened it carefully like it might explode. Inside was actual meat-processed vegetables, something that might have been bread. A feast by slave standards. While she ate, Draven ran through his pre-flight checklist. The ship hummed to life around them. Artificial gravity, stabilizing life support, cycling to full power. Through the porthole, she watched Kepler Station shrink away until it was just another point of light in the endless dark. "Where are we going?" she whispered. The first word she'd spoken since he'd bought her. "Home," he said without looking up from his instruments. "My home. Outer rim planet called Haven's Rest. Quiet place. Good for thinking." She processed this. Most buyers took their purchases to processing centers first, places where they broke you down and rebuilt you according to specifications. But he was taking her to his home. That could mean anything, usually nothing good. "What do you want from me?" The words slipped out before she could stop them. Now he did look at her. Really looked like he was seeing her for the first time. "I want you to heal," he said finally. "Everything else we'll figure out as we go." It was the strangest thing anyone had ever said to her. She didn't understand it, didn't trust it. But for the first time in 17 months, she felt something other than fear. Curiosity, dangerous, foolish curiosity about the man who'd paid too much for a broken slave and then asked her name like it mattered. Haven's Rest wasn't much to look at. Red dirt, sparse vegetation, and a sky the color of old copper. But it was quiet in a way that felt almost sacred after the constant noise of stations and ships and markets. Draven's place sat in a valley between two low hills. Not quite a farm, not quite a homestead. Just a collection of buildings that looked like they'd grown out of the landscape itself. Solar collectors gleamed on the roofs, and she could see workshop smoke rising from a chimney. "Someone's here," she said as they approached the landing pad. Fear crept back into her voice. More people meant more variables, more ways for this strange kindness to turn into something familiar and terrible. "Just Milo," Draven said, powering down the engines. Well, you'll see." The airlock cycled open and they stepped out into air that smelled of metal and wood smoke. The gravity was lighter than standard, making her feel almost weightless after months of heavy station decks. That's when she saw him. Milo emerged from the largest building, wiping his hands on a leather apron. He was tall, maybe 7 feet, with skin like polished obsidian and eyes that shifted color in the changing light. Definitely not human. Definitely not any species she recognized. Every instinct screamed at her to run. In her experience, aliens bought human slaves for very specific purposes. Experiments, entertainment, things that didn't bear thinking about. But Milo just nodded at Draven and looked at her with something that might have been curiosity. Not hunger, not calculation, just quiet interest. This is her. His voice was deep, resonant, like stones grinding together in pleasant harmony. This is her, Draven confirmed. She hasn't told me her name yet. Milo considered this. Names are earned, not given. Perhaps you'll find hers here. The casual way they talked about her, like she was a person with agency instead of property, made her head spin. She stood frozen between them, waiting for the trap to spring, for the masks to come off and reveal the monsters underneath. Instead, Draven walked toward the main house. Come on, let me show you around. The interior was simple but comfortable. Real wood furniture, handmade by the look of it. Books on actual paper shelves, a kitchen that smelled of bread and herbs. Windows that let in natural light instead of the harsh artificial glare she'd grown used to. This'll be your room, Draven said, opening a door near the back of the house. She stepped inside and stopped breathing. It was a real room, not a cell, not a cage, not a storage compartment. A bed with clean sheets and a pillow, a window with curtains, a small table with a water pitcher and basin, even a mirror, something she hadn't seen in months. The door locks, Draven said quietly, from the inside. She stared at him. That couldn't be right. Slaves didn't get locks. Slaves didn't get privacy. Slaves didn't get rooms with windows and mirrors and beds soft enough to actually sleep in. I don't understand, she whispered. Draven leaned against the door frame, careful to stay in the hallway, not crowding her space. What don't you understand? What you want? What the payment is? What happens when I disappoint you? The pain that flashed across his face was brief but unmistakable. There's no payment. There's no service you owe me. You're not property here. You're just a person who needs a safe place to figure out what comes next. That's not how this works. Her voice was stronger now, touched with desperation. That's not how any of this works. People don't just save strangers, not without wanting something. Milo appeared in the hallway behind Draven. Perhaps, he said in that stone-deep voice, your experience has been with the wrong kind of people. She laughed, but there was no humor in it. The wrong kind of people are the only kind there are. No, Draven said simply. They're not. He reached into his pocket and pulled out something that made her breath catch. The key to her shackles. The one he'd used back on the station. He held it out to her. This is yours now, he said. Do whatever you want with it. Keep it. Throw it away, melt it down. Your choice. She stared at the small piece of metal like it was a live explosive. In a way it was. That key represented everything she'd lost, everything that had been taken from her. And now he was just giving it to her. I don't want it, she said. That's fine too. He set it on the table beside the water pitcher. It'll be here if you change your mind. He turned to leave, then paused. There's food in the kitchen whenever you are hungry. Tools in the workshop if you want to keep your hands busy. Books if you like to read. No schedules, no requirements, no expectations. And if I run, then you run. But you might find there's nowhere you need to run to. The door closed behind them with a soft click. She was alone for the first time in 17 months. Really alone with a lock she controlled, and a key that meant freedom, and a choice that terrified her more than any beating ever had. The choice to believe that maybe, just maybe, not everyone in the universe was a monster. 3 days passed in silence. She stayed in her room, mostly coming out only when hunger forced her to. The kitchen was always empty when she ventured in, but there was always fresh food waiting. Bread still warm from the oven. Soup that tasted like actual vegetables instead of protein paste. Water so clean it made her teeth ache. Sometimes she caught glimpses of them through her window. Draven working in what looked like a garden, his mechanical arm moving with surprising gentleness as he tended to plants. Milo at his forge, sparks flying as he shaped metal into things she couldn't identify from a distance. They never looked toward her window, never checked on her, never demanded her presence or her gratitude. It was the strangest prison she'd ever been in. On the 4th day, she found a plate of food outside her door along with something else. A small knife, the kind used for cutting fruit. The handle was worn smooth from use, and the blade was sharp enough to cut more than food if necessary. Any reasonable slave owner would never give a captive a weapon. But then again, reasonable slave owners didn't exist in her experience. She kept the knife under her pillow and slept better that night than she had in months. By the end of the first week, curiosity won over caution. She started exploring the house when she thought they were both busy outside. The books on the shelves were in a dozen different languages, covering everything from agricultural techniques to ancient poetry. Many showed signs of heavy use. In what was clearly Draven's room, she found a small hollow photo tucked into the corner of a mirror. A man who might have been Draven 20 years younger, standing next to a woman with laugh lines around her eyes. Between them stood a little girl with curly hair and blue eyes exactly like her own. The girl was maybe 8 years old in the photo. She had scraped knees and dirt under her fingernails, and the kind of smile that suggested she'd just finished explaining why she absolutely had to bring home the injured bird she'd found. The woman in the photo had been dead for years. She could tell by the way Draven's fingers had worn smooth the edges where he'd touched her face. The little girl, though, she found her answer in a drawer filled with official documents. Death certificate, Emma Mackenzie, age 12. Cause of death, mining accident, Kepler Station, Sector 7. The same sector where she'd been processed before ending up in the slave market. No wonder he'd looked at her like he'd seen a ghost. That night, for the first time since arriving, she left her room after dark. Not to escape, just to see what the world looked like when she chose to step into it. The common area was lit by a single lamp. Draven sat in a worn armchair reading something on a data pad. He looked up when she appeared but didn't speak. Just moved his feet so she could pass if she wanted to. She sat on the edge of the couch as far from him as the furniture allowed. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked quietly. She shook her head. "Too quiet. Takes getting used to. First month here, I kept waking up thinking something was wrong because I couldn't hear engines or life support or crowd noise." "How long have you lived here?" 5 years. Milo was here first. I just showed up one day and never left." She processed this. "He saved you too?" Draven's laugh was dry as desert wind. "Other way around, actually, though I think we saved each other." They sat in comfortable silence for a while. Outside, Haven's Rest settled into its nightly rhythm. Wind through the sparse trees, the distant hum of the workshop's automated systems. Nothing that sounded like danger. "The girl in the photo," she said eventually. "She looked happy." Draven's hands stilled on his data pad. "Emma, she was happy, right up until the end." "Mining accident. Yeah, I was off-world when it happened. Military contract. By the time I got back..." He set the pad aside. "They'd already processed the bodies. Told me there wasn't enough left to bury." The words hung between them like a bridge neither of them knew how to cross. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "So am I. Sorry that the same system that killed my daughter is the one that tried to break you." She looked at him, then really looked. Saw the scars that weren't from battles, but from something deeper. The way his mechanical arm occasionally twitched, like it was trying to reach for someone who wasn't there anymore. "Is that why you bought me, because I look like her?" "At first, maybe." He was quiet for a long moment. "But that's not why you're staying." "Then why?" "Because everyone deserves a chance to remember what it feels like to be human, even when the rest of the galaxy forgets." Something inside her chest cracked open just a little. Not breaking, unfolding. "I don't remember my real name," she admitted. "They called me so many numbers for so long, I forgot what my parents used to call me." "Names are just sounds," Draven said. "What matters is who you are when you answer to them." The next morning she found something new outside her door. Not food this time. A small pendant made of dark metal shaped like a flame. The craftsmanship was exquisite, clearly Milo's work. She turned it over in her hands, feeling the weight of it. The message was clear, even without words. They saw her not as property or charity case or replacement daughter, but as someone worth making something beautiful for. She didn't put it on. Not yet. But she didn't put it back either. That afternoon, she ventured into the workshop for the first time. Milo was at his forge working on what looked like a farming implement. He acknowledged her presence with a nod, but didn't stop working. "The pendant," she said. "Why, fire transforms things," Milo replied without looking up. "Burns away what you don't need, leaves what you do." "What if there's nothing left after the burning?" Now he did look at her, those color-shifting eyes, holding something that might have been understanding. Then you start over. Build something new from the ashes. She watched him work for an hour, saying nothing. The rhythm of hammer on metal was oddly soothing. When she finally left, the pendant was hanging around her neck. Small trust, Draven had called it. But trust was like fire. Start with a spark, feed it carefully, and eventually it might become something that could light the whole world. 2 weeks and the nightmares found her. She woke gasping, sheets soaked with sweat, the taste of metal and fear sharp on her tongue. In her dreams, she was back in the processing center on Kepler Station. Back in the hands of people who saw her as livestock. The walls of her room felt like they were closing in. She needed air, space, something other than the sound of her own ragged breathing. The common area was dark except for the dying embers in the fireplace. She thought she was alone until a shadow moved in Draven's chair. "Bad one?" he asked quietly. She nodded, not trusting her voice, wrapped her arms around herself and tried to stop shaking. "Want to talk about it?" "No." Then after a moment, "Maybe. I don't know." He didn't push, just waited while she found her words. "They had this machine," she said finally, called it a compliance enhancer, basically a torture device designed to break your will without damaging the merchandise. They'd strap you in and... She stopped, shuddered. They said it was more efficient than traditional methods, more humane. Draven's mechanical arm whirred softly as his hands clenched into fists. "The worst part wasn't the pain," she continued. "It was knowing that somewhere, someone had sat down and designed it specifically to cause maximum psychological damage with minimum physical evidence. Someone had thought about how to break people and then built a machine to do it better. How many times does it matter? It matters to me." She looked at him, then saw something dangerous flickering behind his eyes. "Draven, it's over. I'm here now." "How many times does..." His voice was steel wrapped in silk. 17. Once for each escape attempt, plus a few times when they were just bored. The silence that followed was different from their usual comfortable quiet. This silence had teeth. "I need to show you something, Draven said finally. He stood and walked to the fireplace, began pulling off his shirt. She tensed, every instinct screaming warnings about men who remove clothing in dark rooms. But when he turned around, she saw he wasn't interested in her body. He was showing her his. The scar ran from his left shoulder blade to just below his ribs. Not a clean surgical line, but something jagged and brutal, like someone had tried to carve him open with a dull blade. "Zalanian mining tools," he said. "They use sonic cutters that vibrate at frequencies that can slice through rock. When they hit flesh..." He touched the edge of the scar. "I was on a rescue mission. Emma was part of a school group that got caught in a tunnel collapse on Kepler Station. By the time we reached them, the miners had already started using the survivors as leverage." She felt something cold settle in her stomach. Leverage for what? Better working conditions, fair wages, things they should have had all along. The mine owners decided it was cheaper to let a few kids die than negotiate with terrorist miners. What happened? I went in alone, found Emma and 6 other kids in a chamber that was filling with toxic gas. The miners, they weren't monsters. They were desperate people who'd been pushed too far. When they saw what was happening to the children, they tried to help me get them out. He pulled his shirt back on, movements careful around the scar. The sonic cutter caught me when the tunnel started collapsing again. Went deep, nearly severed my spine. I managed to get 3 kids out before the whole section came down. Emma, he sat back down heavily. Emma was in the part that collapsed first. I'm so sorry. The miners died too, all of them. The mine owners called it a terrorist attack, collected insurance on the damaged equipment, and hired new workers the next day. Business as usual. She was quiet for a long time, processing the weight of what he'd shared. Finally, she spoke. My name was Sorry, she said. It means one who remains in the old tongue. My grandmother gave it to me because I was the only baby in her generation to survive past birth on our colony ship. Draven looked up at her, and something in his expression shifted. Recognition, maybe, or just the simple acknowledgement that she trusted him with something precious. Sorry, he repeated, testing the sound of it. It suits you. I haven't said it out loud in over a year, wasn't allowed to. They said names were for people, not property. You were never property, sorry. You were always a person who was stolen. The words hit her like a physical blow, not because they hurt, but because they were true. And truth she'd learned could be more devastating than any lie. Why are you telling me about Emma, about the miners? Because I want you to understand something. The people who hurt you, who built those machines, who created that whole system, they're not some distant evil. They're the same people who let my daughter die because it was profitable. The same people who turned desperate miners into terrorists and traumatized kids into slaves. He leaned forward, and in the firelight, she could see the scars on his face more clearly. Not battle scars, worry lines, grief carved into flesh. And I want you to know that when you're ready, when you're strong enough, we're going to make them pay for every single thing they've done. It wasn't a promise of revenge. It was something deeper, a promise of justice, of balance, of making sure that no other little girl with blue eyes would end up chained in a market because someone decided her life was worth less than profit margins. She asked. If you want, when you're ready, no pressure, no timeline. But yes, She touched the pendant at her throat, felt the warm metal against her skin. Fire transforms things, Milo had said. Burns away what you don't need. Maybe it was time to stop thinking like a victim and start thinking like a survivor. Maybe it was time to remember that she wasn't just someone who remained. She was someone who remained to fight. The days that followed took on a different rhythm. Not the careful dance of strangers anymore, but something warmer, more honest. Sari started helping around the homestead. Not because she was expected to, but because idle hands gave her too much time to think. She discovered she had a talent for organizing Draven's chaotic workshop and an unexpected appreciation for Milo's methodical approach to metallurgy. Your people work metal differently, Milo observed one afternoon as she sorted his tools by function rather than size. More intuitive, less rigid. My people are probably dead, she said matter-of-factly. Mining colony. When the ore ran out, the company pulled support and left everyone to starve or freeze. Perhaps they found another way. Milo heated a piece of steel until it glowed like a small star. Survival takes many forms. She watched him work, hammer ringing against the anvil in steady rhythm. There was something hypnotic about it. Something that reminded her of her grandmother's weaving songs back when she was small enough to believe the universe was fundamentally kind. What were you before this, she asked. Before here, I mean. A killer. Milo's answer was as casual as commenting on the weather. Very good at it, very expensive, very empty inside. What changed? I met someone who showed me that strength could be used to build instead of destroy. He glanced toward the house where Draven was probably reading or planning their next supply run. It is easier to tear down than to create, but only creation lasts. That evening, Sari attempted to cook dinner. It was a disaster of epic proportions. She'd never had access to a real kitchen before, just nutrient dispensers and heating elements. The concept of seasoning was alien to her, and her timing was catastrophically off. The bread was burned on the outside and raw in the middle. The vegetables were somehow both overcooked and undercooked simultaneously. The sauce she'd attempted had the consistency of industrial adhesive. Draven took one bite, chewed thoughtfully, and swallowed with the determination of a man facing enemy fire. Interesting texture, he said diplomatically. It's terrible, Sari said, mortified. I'm sorry, I thought. It's food made with good intentions. That makes it better than anything I've eaten in years. He ate the entire portion. So did Milo, who complimented her on her creative interpretation of traditional flavors. Neither of them mentioned the way their eyes watered or how they drank enormous amounts of water with dinner. Later, as they sat by the fire, Sari found herself smiling. Really smiling, not the careful expression she'd practiced to avoid punishment, but something that bubbled up from somewhere she'd thought was permanently broken. What? Draven asked, noticing her expression. I poisoned you both, and you thanked me for it. Well, technically, you didn't poison us. Food poisoning requires actual toxins. What you did was more like culinary terrorism. She laughed. The sound surprised all three of them. When was the last time she'd laughed? When was the last time she'd wanted to? Tomorrow I'll teach you about heat control, Milo said solemnly, and perhaps the ancient art of tasting as you go. You cook, I forge. The principles are similar. Apply heat, observe results, adjust accordingly. Do not let ego prevent you from starting over when necessary. Over the following days, the cooking lessons became a shared project. Draven contributed what he remembered from camping rations and military field meals. Milo shared techniques that seemed to come from a dozen different worlds. Sari provided enthusiasm and a complete lack of preconceived notions about how things were supposed to be done. They made mistakes. Lots of them. Burned things, seasoned things, created combinations that would have been classified as war crimes on more civilized worlds. But they also created something else. A family. Not the kind bound by blood or law, but the kind forged by choice and seasoned with shared disasters. One morning, Sari found herself humming while she organized spare parts in the workshop. An old Zalanian work song her mother had taught her. She stopped, startled by the sound of her own voice. "Don't stop," Draven said from the doorway. "It's beautiful." I didn't realize I was making noise. It wasn't noise, it was music. There's a difference. She looked down at the parts in her hands. Broken things, worn things, pieces of machines that had seen better days. But with the right tools and enough patience, they could be made useful again. Made whole. "Draven," she said without looking up, "when you said we were going to make them pay. What did you mean exactly?" "I meant we're going to destroy the system that creates slaves and leaves children to die in collapsing mines. We're going to make sure no one else goes through what you went through, what Emma went through." How? Carefully, systematically, and with extreme prejudice. She set down the part she'd been examining and turned to face him. "I want to help, not someday when I'm ready. Now." "Larry, no, listen. I've been thinking about what you said, about the same people being responsible for all of it. They're still out there, still buying and selling people, still letting kids die for profit margins. Every day we wait is another day they hurt someone else." Draven studied her face, looking for signs of trauma response or misplaced revenge fantasies. Instead, he saw something that reminded him of himself at her age. A quiet fury that burned clean and steady, hot enough to forge steel. "It won't be easy," he warned. "And it won't be safe. Nothing worthwhile ever is." That night, they spread maps and data files across the kitchen table. Information about mining operations, slave markets, corporate shipping routes. The beginnings of something that might, with enough planning and luck, actually make a difference. "Where do we start?" Sari asked. Milo looked up from the shipping manifest he had been studying. "With the understanding that once we begin this path, there is no return to the quiet life." "Good," Sari said, touching the flame pendant at her throat. "I'm tired of being quiet." The fire in the hearth crackled softly, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Outside, Haven's Rest settled into its peaceful night routine. But inside, three people who had found each other in the vast darkness of an uncaring galaxy were planning to bring light to places that had been dark for far too long. It was the beginning of something beautiful and something terrible. Sometimes those were the same thing. 3 months of planning, 3 months of careful preparation, building networks, gathering intelligence, 3 months of Sari transforming from broken slave to something harder, sharper, more dangerous. And then Corvin Thaley found them. He arrived just after dawn, his expensive transport gleaming against the red dirt of Haven's Rest like a chrome wound in the landscape. Behind him came 2 hired enforcers and enough firepower to level a small settlement. Sari was in the workshop with Milo when the proximity alarm started screaming. Through the window, she saw the fat Brelin from the slave market stepping out of the transport, his too many teeth gleaming in a predatory smile. Well, Corvin called out as a Draven emerged from the house, hand resting on the weapon at his hip. "The mysterious buyer who overpaid for damaged goods. I told everyone you were either crazy or sentimental, but it turns out you're something much more interesting." "You're trespassing," Draven said evenly. "Leave now." "Oh, I don't think so. You see, I've been doing some research on you, Draven Mackenzie. Decorated veteran, dead daughter, questionable moral compass. And most interesting of all, you've been making inquiries about certain business operations that don't concern you." Sari felt ice form in her veins. Their careful investigation had been too careful. Someone had noticed the patterns, traced the questions back to their source. "I'm here to make you a deal," Corvin continued. "Return my property, forget whatever misguided crusade you have been planning, and I'll pretend this whole incident never happened." "She's not property." Draven's voice carried the kind of cold that preceded violence. "She's merchandise that was purchased under false pretenses. The sale was clearly made to circumvent proper ownership transfer protocols. In other words, theft." One of the enforcers raised his weapon, military-grade designed to punch through civilian body armor. Draven didn't move, but Sari could see the tension in his shoulders. "Here's my counter-offer," Draven said. "You and your friends get back in that fancy ship and never come back. In return, I don't kill all three of you and leave your bodies for the sandcats." Corvin laughed, a sound like wet metal scraping against itself. "One man with a mechanical arm against three armed professionals? I like my odds." That's when Sari stepped out of the workshop. She moved with the fluid grace Milo had taught her during their sparring sessions, the quiet confidence that came from knowing exactly what you are capable of. In her hands were two of Milo's throwing knives, their balance perfect for the task ahead. "Hello, Corvin," she said, her voice carrying none of the fear that had characterized their last meeting. "Miss me?" The Brelan's expression shifted from smugness to something closer to confusion. You're different. I got better." "No matter, you're still merchandise, and merchandise doesn't get to choose its owner." "You're right," Sari said, taking another step forward. "Merchandise doesn't get to choose, but people do." She threw the first knife before he could react. It buried itself in the weapon of the enforcer to Corvin's left, shattering the power cell and sending sparks cascading across the desert floor. The second knife found the throat of the enforcer to his right. Corvin stumbled backward, suddenly very aware that he was alone with three people who had absolutely no reason to let him live. "Here's what's going to happen," Sari said, producing a third knife from somewhere in her clothing. "You are going to get back in your transport. You're going to file a report saying I died in an unfortunate accident during transport. And you're going to make sure every other slave trader in the sector knows that Haven's Rest is off limits. You can't just kill me. I have connections, legal protections." "I'm not gonna kill you," Sari said. "He is." Milo emerged from the workshop like a shadow-given form. In his hands was not one of his elegant forged blades, but something that looked like it had been designed specifically for dismembering large, annoying aliens. "Actually," Draven said conversationally, "I think we should let her choose. After all, he did interrupt her new life to try and drag her back to the old one." Sari looked at the knife in her hand, felt the weight of it, the choice. She could end Corvin right here, right now. Remove one more predator from a galaxy that had too many of them. It would be justice. It would be satisfying. It would be easy. Instead, she threw the knife into the ground at Corvin's feet. "I'm not for sale anymore," she said simply. "I'm not property, I'm not merchandise, and I'm sure as hell not going anywhere with you. But I'm also not going to become a killer just to prove a point." As she stepped closer and Corvin pressed himself against his transport like he could somehow phase through the metal. "I'm going to give you something much worse than death," she continued. "I'm going to give you failure. Every slave you lose, every operation we shut down, every time one of your business partners disappears in the night, you're going to remember this moment. You're going to remember that it all started because you tried to reclaim one broken girl who refused to stay broken." "This isn't over," Corvin snarled, but there was no conviction in it. "You're right," Sari said. "It's just beginning." Corvin scrambled into his transport, leaving his dead enforcer where he had fallen. The engine screamed to life, and within moments, he was nothing but a retreating speck against the copper sky. Draven walked over to stand beside her, looking up at the dissipating exhaust trail. "Think he'll actually file that death report?" he asked. "Doesn't matter. Word will spread either way. Either I'm dead and they stop looking for me, or I'm alive and dangerous and they think twice before coming here. And if they don't think twice," Sari touched the pendant at her throat, felt the warm metal that had once been raw or shapeless and worthless until someone with skill and patience had made it into something beautiful. "Then we remind them why humans are the most dangerous species in the galaxy when they decide to protect something they love." Milo approached, carrying the body of the fallen enforcer. Where should I dispose of this compost pile? Draven suggested. Might as well be useful for something. Sari looked around at Haven's Rest, at the place that had become home at the two men who had become family. This was her choice. Not because she had nowhere else to go, but because this was where she belonged. She wasn't running anymore. She wasn't hiding anymore. She was home, and she was ready to fight for it. 6 months later, Sari stood in the workshop holding something that would have been impossible when she first arrived at Haven's Rest. A telescope. Not the cheap, mass-produced kind sold at station markets, but something Draven had built from scratch, using principles Milo had taught him, and components Sari had salvaged from 3 different wrecked ships. The housing was made from Zilanian steel, polished to mirror brightness. The lenses had been ground with mathematical precision that would make university professors weep with envy, and the mount was a work of art that combined human engineering with alien aesthetics in ways that shouldn't have worked, but absolutely did. "It's beautiful," she said, running her fingers along the smooth barrel. "It's functional," Draven corrected, but there was pride in his voice. "Rated for deep space observations, stellar cartography, even some basic spectral analysis." "What's it for? For looking at the stars without wondering which ones are hiding slave markets." She lifted the telescope to the window, adjusting the focus until the distant mountains sprang into sharp relief. Through the eyepiece, she could see details that had been invisible before. Rock formations, wind patterns, the subtle variations in colors that spoke of different mineral compositions. "There's so much more than I thought," she said softly. "There always is. The universe is bigger and stranger and more wonderful than any of us can imagine. We just have to remember to look up once in a while." That evening, they set up the telescope on the hill behind the house. The 3 of them sat in comfortable silence as the copper sky faded to deep purple, then to black, studded with stars. "Make a wish," Draven said as the first meteor streaked across the darkness. "I don't need to," Sari replied. "I already have everything I wished for." Through the telescope, the galaxy revealed itself in layers, distant suns with their own planetary families. Nebulae where new stars were being born from cosmic dust and gravity. The infinite depth of space that connected every world, every life, every story. "Do you think they're out there?" she asked. "Other people like us, fighting the same fight." "I know they are," Milosaurus said. "The galaxy is vast, but injustice leaves patterns. Where there are patterns, there are people working to break them." "Good," Sari said, "because we're going to need all the help we can get." Over the past 6 months, their small rebellion had grown. Other veterans had found their way to Haven's Rest, former slaves who'd heard whispered stories about a place where people like them could find peace and purpose. Scientists whose research had been suppressed. Miners whose families had been destroyed by corporate greed. Not an army, something better. A network of people who understood that the fight wasn't about revenge. It was about making sure the next generation inherited a galaxy where children didn't die in collapsing mines, and people weren't sold like livestock. "Sorry," Draven said quietly. "I need you to know something." She lowered the telescope and looked at him. "When I first saw you in that market, part of me was thinking about Emma, about how she might have ended up in a place like that if things had gone differently. But that's not why you're here. I know. You're here because you chose to be, because you took a life that someone else tried to define for you and made it into something they never imagined. You turned pain into purpose, trauma into strength. That's not something that can be given or taken away. That's something you built yourself." She touched the pendant at her throat, the flame that had become her symbol, her reminder that fire didn't just destroy. It also transformed. "We all built it," she said, "together." "Yes," Milo agreed, "together." They sat under the stars until dawn, planning and dreaming and preparing for the work ahead. When the first light of Haven's Rest season touched the horizon, Sari made a decision. "I want to tell you my full name," she said. "My real name, the one my grandmother gave me before the mining company took over our colony." Draven and Milo waited. "Sari Vathan. It means the one who remains to kindle new fires. She said I would burn away the old world and help build a better one." "Sounds like she was a wise woman," Draven said. "The wisest." And she was right. Sari stood and picked up the telescope, cradling it like the precious thing it was. "I'm ready now. Ready to stop running, stop hiding, stop being afraid of what comes next." What comes next is work, Milo warned. Dangerous work, the kind that changes you. Good, Sari said, looking out at the landscape that had become home, at the two men who had become family, at the future that stretched ahead like an uncharted star map. I like who I'm becoming. As the sun climbed higher, painting the desert in shades of gold, and promised three unlikely rebels prepared to take their fight to the stars. They had tools and weapons and plans that would make slave traders wake up screaming. But most importantly, they had each other, and they had hope. In a galaxy where hope was the rarest commodity of all that made them the most dangerous people alive. The girl who had once been property had become something the universe had never seen before. She had become free, and she was going to make sure everyone else had the same chance, one slave market at a time, one corporate boardroom at a time, one star system at a time, until the galaxy remembered what it meant to treat every thinking being as if their life had value. Until every child could look up at the stars and see wonder instead of fear. Until there were no more chains. If this story moved you, if it made you think about freedom and justice and what it means to be human in an infinite universe, then leave a comment below. Tell us about a time when someone showed you kindness when you needed it most. Share this video with someone who believes in fighting for what's right. And don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell, because there are more stories like this coming. Stories about ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Stories about hope winning against impossible odds. Stories about humanity at its very best. Until next time, keep looking up at the stars. And remember that somewhere out there, people like Sari and Draven and Milo are fighting to make sure those stars shine a little brighter for everyone. Thank you for listening.